All right, hi everybody and welcome to the next video on advanced incident tracking. In the previous videos, we already discussed two advanced grouping strategies. One was on grouping alarms based on relation learning, and the other one was statistical grouping. Today, I want to discuss one final advanced grouping strategy, a very powerful one, called grouping on custom property, right? Let me start by explaining what this is all about. Assume for a moment that you are a cable operator. You're working in an ABM setup and you have a bunch of nodes. And these nodes are sending out a signal. But of course, these nodes are far away from the homes of the people. So because of this large distance, the signal will need to be amplified. So instead of sending the signal directly to the people at home, the node is going to send the signal to a bunch of amplifiers. They amplify the signal and then send it along. Typically, there are many amplifiers under a given node, but just for simplicity, I've only indicated 3 amplifiers under each node. Now assume for a moment that all the amplifiers under node 1 are suddenly an alarm. Then probably this is not really a problem of the amplifier, but it's more likely that this is a problem of the parent node, node 1. The fact that all the amplifiers under node 1 suddenly go into alarm, I guess this indicates that there's an issue on node 1. So it would make perfect sense in this case to group all the alarms on these amplifiers, because actually they have the same root cause, an issue on node 1. Now this is something that you can accomplish by grouping on custom properties. The idea would be that you add a custom property called parent node, for example, to the alarms on amplifiers. So you can arrange, maybe by changing the protocol or other things, you can make sure that the alarms that are triggered by these amplifiers, that they contain a property called parent node, and that the value of this property is node 1. Similarly, you can make sure that the alarms on these amplifiers also have this parent node property set to node 2. And finally, you can make sure that all of the amplifier alarms here also have an alarm property called parent node with value node 3. Next, you can then configure incident tracking to automatically group alarms that have the same alarm property value, i.e. that have the same parent node. And that way you can accomplish what you want. All right. Before showing all of this in a demo, it's definitely going to become a lot more clear and hands-on. I'm going to give you a little bit of theoretical background. I'm going to tell you how you can make these configurations in DataMiner. Okay. It's okay to skip this if you're going to follow the demo because it will all become clear. But for the sake of completeness, I want to mention this anyways. So, grouping on custom properties. First of all, grouping on custom properties, what properties? Well, I just mentioned that you can group on alarm properties, but actually you can also group on element, service, or view properties. So there's quite some flexibility. You can group on existing properties, but you can also create your own property that you want to group on. Creating a property is very easy, and I'll show you how you can do it in the demo. What is important is that when you create a property, that you enable update alarms on value changed. If you don't do this, then we cannot use that property for incident tracking because we don't get any updates when the property changes. Next, how do you configure incident tracking to group based on your custom property? Well, as always, the advanced configuration can be found in the configuration.xml file, which is in your Skyline DataMiner analytics folder. When you look at that XML, at the bottom, you will probably find a piece of XML code mentioning a generic property visitor configuration. If you've never played around with this, you will have this XML code with an empty value tag. Inside this value tag, we will have to specify on which property we want to group. Okay, so we start with this piece of code and an empty value tag, and now we're going to add an item in this value tag for each property that we want to use for grouping. If you want to group based on an alarm property, you should add this kind of XML code. You add a generic alarm property visitor configuration, and this has two settings you have enabled, which you will probably set to true. And here you have to mention the property name that you want to use for grouping. Going back to the example here, the property name would be parent node. Similarly, you can group on a view property by using this kind of code. The only difference really is that instead of a generic alarm property visitor configuration, you have a generic view property visitor configuration. Similarly, if you want to group using a service property, you add this kind of code, where we're dealing with a generic service property visitor configuration. And here you just mention the name of the property that you want to use for grouping. And finally, you can also group using an element property by adding a generic element property visitor configuration. Notice that here there is an additional threshold or an additional setting that appears. If you've seen my video on statistical grouping, you probably can already suspect what the meaning of this parameter is. In any case, it will all become clear in our next video, where I'm going to give a nice demo on this. Let me wrap up this theoretical part by just mentioning that there are further resources here if you want to know more about this topic. There's a video from Rui, focused on the root of issues with incident analysis. It can be worth your time. And of course, you can find more information in our docs. All right, so that was all the theoretical stuff. I hope that was clear. Let's now bring this into practice in a real life example. See you in the next video.